Hello, friends and family, and welcome back to episode 6 of 10 about my great grandmother, Alta Rivers Gilbert Thornton. In this episode, we'll learn about Alta's grandmother, my third great grandmother, who I believe was an important figure in Alta Rivers' life. I've got a copy of her divorce record, finally answering where her mother's maiden name Bab comes from, and I've got photos. Not of Eliza or Alta, unfortunately, but of two of Eliza's siblings, one of whom is famous thanks to the old newspaper series later turned into a book and movie, The Hoosier Schoolmaster. This episode is titled Alta River's Grandmother Eliza. Eliza's full married name was Eliza Ann Ridgway, born August 13th, 1828, and died June 13th, 1909, at the age of 80. And that's only 1 year before we find Alta in the 1910 census living with her sister in Indianapolis. We aren't going to climb any higher in this tree than Eliza, but here you'll also see that Eliza's father's name is Gabriel Phillips. I'm going to walk you through everything that I've got for her in chronological order. Here is the 1850 census. We have Gabriel Phillips and wife Susanna with 4 children: James, Eliza, 21, Sarah, and then a fourth brother, Henry. It says that Gabriel was from Virginia and owned about $800 in property. Susanna was from Kentucky, and all the children are born in Indiana. So we can assume they've been in Indiana since at least 1824, based on James being 26 and born in Indiana. When I first started working on my tree in Ancestry, this is all that I can find that connected Eliza to the name Bab. It says that she married a William Bab November 5th, 1851. With a little help, I found a copy of their actual marriage certificate, but it didn't give me any more information than what I showed you previously. Thankfully, we have Eliza's testimony from Caroline Alice's court trial, so I was able to corroborate the marriage and the timing. Remember this quote from episode 5, where Eliza says, "I am Alice Gilbert's mother. She was born August 11th, 1852. I was married November 6th, 1851. Then, like I said, by 1860, Eliza is remarried to Samuel Ridgway, a farmer with a worth of about $2,000 in property. Also in the household is Caroline Alice Babb, 7 years old, and we see that Eliza has two more children, Mary J. and John Ridgway. I learned from Eliza's father Gabriel's will that he passes in 1865. If you remember Eliza's testimony from episode 5, you'll know that she emphatically stated that she had money from her father, and she said it was hers to do with whatever she pleased. We know that she purchased the land with the inheritance from her father in 1869. 1870, Eliza is still with Samuel and her two youngest children. In 1872, Eliza gifts the land to Caroline. And here's the 1880 census that you've seen several times before, but this time calling attention to the fact that this is Eliza and her husband living right next to Caroline, Samuel, and Alta River's siblings. And to round it out, Eliza is in the census with Alta River's brother, Robert Gilbert, in 1900. Also notice that she owns her own home, though it is in Jefferson Township, not Craig, where the land dispute happened in the 1870s. Here is where I pause to say that I spent an embarrassing amount of time looking for William Babb. I tried to tell myself that it didn't really matter to my research into Alta Rivers. I assumed that he died young and I just couldn't find the record for him. I would do some intensive weekends of search and then put it away for a couple of weeks, sometimes even longer. And then one morning last summer, I woke up with Eliza on my mind. I had not been doing any search the night before, but that morning I just had her strongly on my mind, and I thought there is something more that she wants me to find. But it was a work day, and I had to travel 2.5 hours to the west part of the state for some meetings. One of the meetings I showed up early for, and I thought, I've got a little bit of extra time. Let me pull out my phone and let me do a casual search while I waited. And within minutes, I found this. It was from genealogytrails.com. The right side is a screenshot from my phone, and the left is a web version. It says, State of Indiana, in the Switzerland Circuit Court, Eliza Babb versus William Babb, petition for divorce. So I immediately found a copy of the divorce petition. It says that in May 1854, Babb abandoned Eliza and had not made any provisions for her. And it says, quote, she has been obliged to depend upon her own industry and the charity of her father for a support for herself and family in sickness and in health. In another section, it references a female child who we know is Caroline Alice. Eliza is asking for divorce and for custody of her child. It continues to explain that, quote, and your petitioner would further show to your honorable that the William has treated your petitioner in a cruel and inhumane manner by whipping and beating your petitioner and otherwise ill using her. Your petitioner would further show that she has a bed and bedding, one tableware, and 3 chairs. This page explains the process. Basically, William was summoned to be part of the proceeding, and if he failed to appear, the judge would grant the divorce. The notice summoning William Babb had to be printed in the paper for 3 weeks successively. And then later in court, a clerk testified that they did indeed run it in the newspaper. We learned from the end of the record that all conditions were met. The divorce was granted, and Eliza won custody of Caroline and the property in her possession. To end on a positive note, 2 years later, Eliza Babb married Samuel Ridgway. Since I found Eliza's father Gabriel's will, and since it names what I presume to be all of his children, I did a little bit of poking around to see what I can learn about them. I'll briefly share a few nuggets about 4 of them: Adelia, Richard, Sarah, and James, starting with Adelia, the oldest. This is Adelia's obituary, clipped from the Newton Press in Newton, Illinois, and says, Miss Adelia Hall, mother of our fellow townsman Arch Hall, died at her home after an illness of 3 days of congestion of the bowels, aged 63 years, 1 month, and 1 day. She had been married 55 years and 1 month, and leaves a husband and 8 grown children to mourn her demise. Something else that is interesting is that she's listed as Black on the 1870 census. It is the only record that I have seen her listed as such, but it is given after she moved from Indiana to Illinois after the Civil War. So it gave me pause. I see this quite a bit on my paternal side where I've got record of having free persons of color in my ancestry and living in mixed race communities, but this is the first that I've seen on my maternal side. There can be several different reasons for this. Number one, I suppose someone could argue that it's a mistake, but I looked on every entry on this record, not just the page, but for the entire community, and this is the only one without a clear W in the race column. Number two, she could have been seen by the census taker as having dark skin, and he just made an assumption that she had Black or African heritage. Remember that we found record of Robert and Fred described as dark complexioned. If this were the case, though, I would be surprised that she was not instead listed as mulatto, which is defined as having 3/8 to 5/8 Black blood. A third reason could be because she was actually Native American, but not living on a reservation. I've done a lot of research about this, but here are a few quick facts from this article on archives.gov. Basically, Indigenous persons began to be enumerated on the census records in the 1860s, but 1870 census was the first to list Indian as a choice for the color column. But the government was less interested in capturing how a person identified and more interest in knowing how many people they could tax. As this article explains, the instructions for Indians not taxed is meant for living on reservations under the care of government agents or roaming as individuals or in bands in unsettled tracts of the country. Sometimes they were defaulted to being mulatto or black, basically non-white, and that could have been the case here. Living less than an hour away from Adelia by modern day travel was Eliza and Adelia's brother, Richard. This newspaper clipping describes him as a veteran of the Civil War and carpenter. Next is Eliza's sister, Sarah. These photos were sent to me by one of her descendants. Thank you very much. She even scanned the back of it for me to verify her name. She is with her daughter and grandson named Philip, I suppose deriving from Sarah's maiden name. I don't know much about Sarah other than, unlike Adelia and Richard, Sarah stayed in Indiana, though she did move from Switzerland County where the siblings were born, as was Alta Rivers and her siblings. And perhaps the most fun find are these articles about James Phillips, Eliza's brother. Starting with the article from New York Times dated in 1897, it reads, James Phillips, the original of James Phillips and Edward Eggleston's Hoosier Schoolmaster, has been stricken with paralysis at his home in Vevey. As he is 76 years of age, it is not expected that he will recover. It is said that he was the only character in the book drawn from real life. So that's super interesting. I had never heard of Edward Eggleston or the Hoosier Schoolmaster. We'll talk a little bit about it, but first let's read this next article from the Boston Evening Transcript 3 years later. It says Mr. James Solomon Phillips, better known as James Phillips of Eggleston's Hoosier Schoolmaster, died the other day at Vevey, Indiana. He was born in June 1821 in Switzerland County near Vevey, Indiana, and spent his days in the same county. He had an unusual faculty in his younger days for spelling, which made him a marked character in the Hoosier Schoolmaster. He was averse to having his picture taken, and although often asked to do so, never consented until a few years ago. Let's pause on that last sentence. I find it very compelling that now we have corroborated the family narrative about Alta Rivers not wanting her photo taken. The family says it was her Native American belief that the camera would capture her soul. This article doesn't say why James didn't want his photo taken. Maybe it was just pride. But the fact that it mirrors what we know the family has said about Alta Rivers is significant to me. Just for the record, here is James's death certificate naming Gabriel Phillips and Susanna House as his parents. Date of death, May 13th, 1900. So it aligns with the article. So what was the Hoosier Schoolmaster, and what is this about being a master speller? The Hoosier Schoolmaster was a weekly column in newspapers across the country about life in backwoods Indiana. The author Edward Eggleston lived in Switzerland County, Indiana, where we've been talking about this entire series. Let's read a little about James from the book preface from Edward Eggleston's own words. He says, James Phillips, name and all, is a real person whom at the time of writing this story I had not seen since I was a lad of 9 and he a man of nearly 40. He was a mere memory to me and was put into the book with some slighting remarks which the real James did not deserve. I did not know that he was living, and it did not seem likely that the story would have the vitality enough to travel all the way to Indiana. But the portion referring to Phillips was transferred to the county paper circulating among James's neighbors. For once, the good-natured man was, as they say in Hoosier, mad, and he threatened to thrash the editor. Do you think he means you? Demanded the editor. To be sure he does, said the champion speller. Can you spell? I can spell down any master that ever came to our district, he replied. As time passed on, Phillips found himself a lion. Strangers desired an introduction to him as a nobility and invited the champion to dissipate with them at the soda fountain in the village drugstore. It became a matter of pride for him that he was the most famous speller in the world. This article from June 1900, it appears that someone asked Eggleston about James, and his response was published in the VV Reveille. It says, quote, in regard to your question, when the Hoosier Schoolmaster was written, I was inexperienced. I thought I may lay hold of anything in the dim memories of the past. I had known James when I was 8 years old. I thought him dead, if I thought at all. I was writing at the top of my speed. The story was done in 10 weeks' time. I wanted a champion speller. I remembered a married man who came into our spelling matches and who could spell down the master. I put him in without thinking, writing his name inconsistently, as it were. The part of the Hoosier relating to the school appeared in the Reveille, and Jim instantly recognized himself. Very truly, Edward Eggleston. Being the most famous speller in the world, this character was very popular and even more intriguing to people that it was based on a real life person. So when James was paralyzed in 1897, it was widely circulated in the news. These articles from Chicago, New York Times, Grand Rapids, Michigan, all talk about him as being the real life character from the book. Here are a few more articles about James before his death. The first one on the right says about James, quote, although too old for work, he lives very comfortably in a little cottage here, and while not now quite so broad as the author made him, he still has many of the peculiarities that made the character so entertaining. Mr. Phillips is about 77 years of age and is very proud of the distinction conferred upon him. The middle article describes James as long, awkward, and ungainly, and generally worthless, but was a great speller. And in those days, that was a distinction enough for a man like Phillips, as he was a hero in his community. Here's a photo of Eggleston. This article adds to the story that James would not speak to Dr. Eggleston until one of his visits to Vivi. When the breach between author and study was amicably closed, the old fellow, meaning James, took Mr. Eggleston to see his mother, who was a teacher in the county. It took searching nearly 300 articles about him, but finally I found two photos. One looks more like a sketch. The headline says James Phillips of Hoosier Schoolmaster fame, dead at his rural home. Again, mention of him being averse to taking his picture, but he consented in his later years at the request of the Cincinnati Enquirer. And here's the last slide for this episode, a touching tribute from the Republic that I would like to read in full. The death of James Sullivan Phillips at Vivi, Indiana, would have attracted no attention outside of his immediate neighborhood, and not much even there, had it not been for the fact that he was the original of Edward Eggleston's character, James Phillips, in the Hoosier Schoolmaster. The only thing that characterized James above his fellow men was that he was a good speller. Eggleston says that he wasn't much account for anything, only just to spell, and that he could spell Webster's Elementary through without missing a word. And now when James has been gathered to his fathers, his picture is printed in the newspaper and the obituary writers are doing him justice. And when the recording angel writes the name of James Phillips in the book of life, he will have to be very careful about the spelling or else James will correct him. And if one were disposed to moralize a little on the life of the departed, he might well say that it is immeasurably better to be good for something than to be good for nothing, even if that something should be to know how to spell. When one sees so many persons that are good for nothing, that have not in any sense in anything distinguished themselves above their fellow men, unless it be in general or special worthlessness, it magnifies a man in general, and public esteem that it is good for something, even if that something be but a small or humble thing. The man that fills a humble station in life and fills it well will measure up in the end. When the books are cast up with him who has filled a more exalted station in the world's esteem. Nay, he will get the greater credit unless the other man has filled his station with equal faithfulness and conscientiousness. We would not hold up James Phillips as a character to imitate, though we would be glad if more people could spell. But we would urge that every person learn to do something and to do it well. One thing I want to note is that I think in another article, his middle name was referenced as Solomon, so I don't know which one was incorrect. Regardless, that was a touching tribute of James, and I too feel proud that he represented the family so well. That concludes this episode. I hope that it was worth the week's wait. The next episode is one that everybody has been waiting for. We finally find a record of Alta Rivers before 1910 with her sisters and even one article mentioning her father. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.